She thought she was marrying a reclusive tech billionaire. Charlotte said, "I do," under the glittering chandeliers of the plaza, completely unaware that her new husband's wealth wasn't from Wall Street. It was centuries old, when Alistair bypassed the airport for their Paris honeymoon and drove her deep into a forgotten, off-grid forest. The fairy tale shattered. The mansion wasn't on any map, the staff didn't breathe, and Charlotte realized her happily ever after was a life sentence in the dark. Charlotte Gray was a woman grounded entirely in facts, history, and the tangible world. As a senior art restorer at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, her life was measured in brushstrokes, chemical solvents, and the quiet, sterile environment of the conservation labs. She was 28, pragmatically single, and shared a cramped Upper West Side apartment with her college best friend, Catherine. Charlotte's world was safe, predictable, and entirely unextraordinary, until the evening of the museum's annual winter gala. The event was a sea of New York's elite, a swirling mass of designer gowns and inherited wealth. Charlotte was only there because the museum director required the department heads to mingle with potential donors. She stood near a massive floral arrangement, sipping a glass of lukewarm champagne when the temperature in the room seemed to inexplicably drop. That was the exact moment Alistair Montgomery walked in. Alistair was a phantom in the New York social scene. The financial papers labeled him a private equity magnate, a man who had made billions in rare earth minerals and European real estate. He was rarely photographed, notoriously private, and breathtakingly handsome. He possessed sharp, aristocratic features, raven dark hair, and eyes that were a piercing, impossible shade of pale gray. He moved with a liquid, predatory grace that parted the crowd of socialites as if by magic. And out of the hundreds of influential people in the room, those pale, magnetic eyes locked instantly onto Charlotte. "You look as though you'd rather be anywhere else," a low, velvet voice murmured beside her. Charlotte jumped, nearly spilling her champagne. Alistair had crossed the room so quietly she hadn't even heard his footsteps. Up close, his presence was overwhelming. He smelled faintly of rain on stone, cedar, and something sharp and metallic. "I prefer the art to the audience," Charlotte replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Alistair smiled, a slow, devastating curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "A woman of substance. How rare." That night marked the beginning of a whirlwind, intoxicating courtship that defied all logic. Alistair was relentless. He didn't just date Charlotte, he consumed her reality. The following evening, he rented out the entirety of Per Se, just for the two of them. He sent hundreds of rare, blood-red Baccara roses to her restoration lab, their heavy perfume overwhelming the scent of turpentine and varnish. But looking back, there were red flags, bizarre, subtle anomalies that Charlotte, blinded by the sheer force of his charisma and the fairy tale nature of it all, willfully ignored. Alistair only ever met her after sunset. He claimed he suffered from a severe form of polymorphic light eruption, a rare extreme sensitivity to UV rays. His penthouse on Billionaires Row overlooking Central Park had heavy, mechanized blackout blinds that were never raised. He never ate during their dinners, always claiming he had just come from a massive business lunch or suffered from a restrictive dietary condition. His skin, flawless and pale, was always shockingly cold to the touch, like marble left out in the winter air. "He's a billionaire, Charlotte," Catherine had said one night as Charlotte packed an overnight bag. "They all have weird quirks. Jeff Bezos probably eats iguana meat. Elon Musk wants to die on Mars. Your guy just likes the dark and has bad circulation. Put a ring on it before a supermodel steals him." And put a ring on it he did. The proposal happened exactly 3 months after they met, on the balcony of his penthouse, under a starless, overcast sky. The ring was an antique, a massive cushion-cut diamond flanked by blood rubies, set in blackened platinum. It felt incredibly heavy, almost burdensome on her finger. The wedding was the social event of the decade, held at the Plaza Hotel in late November. Charlotte wore custom Oscar de la Renta, a vision in heavy ivory silk and antique lace. Yet, as she walked down the aisle toward Alistair, a strange, creeping sense of dread settled in the pit of her stomach. The groom's side of the aisle was mostly empty, populated only by a few severe-looking men and women who didn't smile, didn't whisper, and barely seemed to blink. Alistair's right-hand man, Richard, a towering, silent man with a face like carved granite, stood as the best man. When Alistair took Charlotte's hands at the altar, his touch chilled her through the silk of her gloves. "I, Alistair, take you, Charlotte, to have and to hold," he recited, his voice echoing in the cavernous ballroom. "For eternity," he didn't say, "until death do us part." Charlotte barely registered the omission over the sound of her own heartbeat. As he leaned in to kiss her, she felt a sudden, sharp pressure against her lower lip, a kiss so intense it bordered on painful. The crowd erupted into applause, but as Charlotte looked out at the sea of faces, she realized the people on Alistair's side weren't clapping. They were simply staring at her, their eyes dark and hungry. The Manhattan illusion was complete. The trap had successfully been sprung. The itinerary was supposed to be simple. Following the reception, they were to be driven to Teterboro Airport, where Alistair's private Gulfstream would whisk them away for a month-long honeymoon in Paris and the Maldives. Charlotte had packed linen sundresses, wide-brimmed hats, and French conversational guides. They slipped out the back entrance of the plaza at 1 a.m., avoiding the paparazzi. An imposing matte black armored Maybach waited at the curb. Richard was in the driver's seat. As soon as the heavy bulletproof door clicked shut, sealing them in the soundproof cabin, the atmosphere drastically shifted. The plush leather smelled intensely of that same metallic cedar scent Alistair wore. Charlotte let out a long, exhausted sigh, kicking off her designer heels and leaning her head against Alistair's shoulder. "Finally," she whispered. "I thought the photographers were going to blind us." Alistair didn't wrap his arm around her. He sat perfectly rigid, staring straight ahead at the opaque partition separating them from Richard. "The spectacle is over. Now we begin." Charlotte frowned, lifting her head. "Are we far from Teterboro? I can't wait to sleep on the plane." Alistair finally turned to look at her. The dim, ambient streetlights flashing through the tinted windows illuminated his face. The charming, attentive billionaire who had wooed her in crowded restaurants was gone. In his place sat a man whose features seemed sharper, almost predatory. His pale grey eyes looked utterly black in the shadows. "We are not going to Paris, my love," he said, his voice stripped of its usual warmth, leaving behind a cold, resonant authority. Charlotte laughed nervously. "What? Did you change the destination? Are we going straight to the Maldives?" "We are going home," Alistair replied simply. Charlotte pulled back, confusion giving way to a flicker of genuine anxiety. She glanced out the window. They were speeding north on the Henry Hudson Parkway, the glittering Manhattan skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror. They were heading out of the city toward upstate New York. "Alistair, what are you talking about? Your penthouse is home. My things are packed for Europe." She reached for her designer clutch to grab her phone. "Let me check the flight." Before her fingers could brush the leather purse, Alistair's hand shot out. His grip wrapped around her wrist like a steel vice. It wasn't just a firm hold. The physical strength behind it was inhuman. The intense, freezing cold of his skin shocked her system. "Do not reach for your phone, Charlotte," he commanded softly. "You're hurting me," she gasped, trying to yank her arm away. It didn't budge a millimeter. Panic, raw and suffocating, spiked in her chest. "Alistair, let go of me. What is going on?" He released her wrist slowly, his gaze burning into hers. "You are my wife now. You belong to me. The rules of your previous life no longer apply. You will learn to obey, and you will learn to adapt." Charlotte scrambled backward, pressing her back against the opposite door of the Maybach. She frantically pulled at the door handle, but it was deadlocked. She pounded her fist against the thick, reinforced glass. Richard, pull the car over. I want to get out." The partition remained dark. The car only accelerated, the engine a low, powerful hum as they merged onto the interstate heading deep into the Adirondack Mountains. "Save your breath," Alistair said, leaning back into the luxurious leather seating, entirely unfazed by her panic. "The glass is soundproof, and even if it weren't, Richard answers only to me. He has served my family for 200 years. Charlotte froze. The absurdity of the statement momentarily cut through her terror. 200? What? Are you insane? Alistair, stop this car right now. This is kidnapping." "It is a homecoming," he corrected calmly. "I could not leave you in that filthy, crowded city. You are a queen now, Charlotte. Though you do not understand it yet, I have elevated you. The human world is a fleeting, decaying thing. Where we are going, time does not exist." For the next 4 hours, Charlotte sat huddled in the corner of the car, trembling violently. She watched in horror as the GPS screen on the center console lost its signal, the digital map fading into a blank gray grid. The paved highway gave way to a 2-lane mountain road, and eventually Richard turned off the main route entirely onto a treacherous, unpaved logging path, completely swallowed by a dense, suffocating forest of ancient pines. There were no streetlights, no signs of civilization, just the sweeping beams of the Maybach's headlights cutting through a thick, unnatural fog that seemed to roll off the trees. Charlotte watched Alistair out of the corner of her eye. He hadn't moved an inch in hours. He didn't fidget, didn't stretch his legs, didn't so much as blink. He was a statue carved from ice, watching the dark woods roll by with an expression of deep, ancient satisfaction. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking, the reality of her nightmare finally settling over her. Alistair turned his head slowly. The ambient light caught his mouth, and for the first time Charlotte noticed the elongation of his canine teeth, sharp and brilliant against his pale lips. "I am exactly what I promised to be," he murmured. "Your eternity." The Maybach finally slowed as the dense tree line broke, revealing a clearing so massive it defied the rugged geography of the mountains. Rising from the mist, illuminated by cold, archaic gas lamps, stood Ironwood Estate. Charlotte gasped, pressing her hands against the cold glass. It wasn't a house, it was a fortress. The architecture was a terrifying blend of Victorian Gothic and medieval monstrosity, boasting black stone turrets, sprawling wings, and hundreds of narrow, arched windows that stared out into the dark like hollow, dead eyes. Massive wrought-iron gates, intricately forged into the shapes of writhing briars and ravens, slowly swung open automatically as the car approached. There was no driveway, only a sprawling courtyard of crushed black obsidian that crunched loudly under the Maybach's tires. As the car rolled to a stop, the heavy front doors of the manor opened. A line of staff stood on the grand stone portico. There were about a dozen of them, dressed in impeccably tailored, antiquated uniforms. They stood in perfect, unnatural stillness. No one shivered in the freezing mountain air. No one shifted their weight. Richard opened the car door. The biting cold of the mountain night rushed in, chilling Charlotte to the bone through her thin silk wedding dress. She refused to move. Alistair stepped out seamlessly, then leaned back in, offering his hand. "Come, Charlotte, your subjects are waiting." "I'm not getting out," she cried, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "I want to go back. Please, Alistair, I won't tell anyone. Just let me go." His expression hardened, the last vestiges of his human facade crumbling away. With terrifying speed, he reached into the car, clamped his hand around her waist, and practically lifted her out onto the obsidian gravel. Charlotte stumbled, her knees weak, but his iron grip kept her upright. "Do not embarrass me in front of my household," he hissed into her ear, his breath devoid of any warmth. "Walk with your head high." He dragged her toward the steps. As they ascended, the staff bowed in perfect, terrifying unison. At the head of the line stood an older woman with severe grey hair pulled into a tight bun and skin the color of old parchment. "Welcome home, my lord," the woman said. Her voice was raspy, dry as dust. She turned her hollow, sunken eyes toward Charlotte. "And to you, my lady, I am Mrs. Gable. I oversee the household. We have prepared your chambers." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Alistair said smoothly. "My wife is tired from the journey. She requires no food, only rest." Charlotte opened her mouth to scream, to beg Mrs. Gable for help, but one look at the housekeeper's dead, unblinking eyes silenced her. These people were not captives. They were complicit. They were exactly like him. The interior of Ironwood Estate was a suffocating display of immense, ancient wealth. The grand foyer featured sweeping double staircases carved from dark mahogany, heavy velvet tapestries depicting brutal battle scenes, and chandeliers dripping with blood-red crystals. The air smelled of old paper, dried roses, and that ever-present, faint metallic tang of copper. "The east wing is yours to explore during the daylight hours," Alistair instructed, leading her up the grand staircase. "The library, the conservatories, the drawing rooms, but you are expressly forbidden from entering the west wing. The doors are locked, for your protection. The servants do not venture there, and neither will you." He ushered her down a long, dimly lit corridor, lined with antique mirrors that had all been covered with heavy black drapes. He opened a set of double doors to a master suite that was larger than her entire apartment in the city. A massive four-poster bed, draped in crimson velvet, dominated the room. There was a roaring fire in the hearth, but it did nothing to warm the freezing chill of the air. "Rest," Alistair commanded, releasing her arm. He didn't step into the room with her. He lingered in the doorway, a creature of the dark, watching his prize in its cage. "I have matters to attend to before sunrise. Do not try to leave the suite. The exterior doors are bolted, and the forest is full of things much less forgiving than I am." The heavy oak doors slammed shut, the lock engaged with a loud, definitive click. Charlotte collapsed onto the plush oriental rug, sobbing until her ribs ached. The reality of her situation was a crushing, suffocating weight. She had married a monster. She was trapped in an uncharted fortress with a man who claimed to be centuries old. Hours passed. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked methodically, the only sound in the dead silence of the manor. Charlotte's survival instinct slowly began to override her despair. She couldn't just sit here and wait to be a victim. She wiped her face, stood up, and began to investigate her golden cage. The room was lavish, filled with priceless antiques. She checked the massive bay windows. They were reinforced glass, locked with heavy iron latches she couldn't budge. She checked the adjoining bathroom, marveling grimly at the clawfoot tub tub and gold fixtures, noting the stark absence of any mirrors. Then she noticed a small, slightly ajar door tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain near the fireplace. Charlotte cautiously pushed it open. It wasn't a closet. It was a narrow, unlit servants' corridor. Her heart pounded furiously against her ribs. Alistair said the exterior doors were bolted, but perhaps there was a way to the ground floor, a way to find a landline, a weapon, anything. She slipped into the dusty, narrow hallway, using the dim light of her phone, which had exactly 12% battery and zero signal, to guide her. The passage twisted and turned, descending a narrow spiral staircase that bypassed the main floors. She walked for what felt like miles, navigating the labyrinthine walls of the estate. Eventually, she reached a heavy iron door at the end of the passage. It wasn't locked. She pushed it open, wincing as the hinges groaned in the silence. Charlotte stepped out into a massive, cavernous gallery. It was freezing here, the air thick with dust. She shone her phone's flashlight around, her breath catching in her throat. She had somehow bypassed the main halls and ended up in the forbidden West Wing. The gallery was filled with covered statues and rows of massive, ornate oil paintings. Charlotte, an art restorer by trade, couldn't help but be drawn to the canvases. They were centuries old, masterworks by artists whose names belonged in textbooks. She walked slowly down the aisle, her flashlight beam dancing over portraits of stern-faced men in medieval armor, women in Elizabethan collars, and chaotic, bloody landscapes. At the very end of the gallery, resting on a grand wooden easel, was a painting that was not covered in dust. It looked meticulously cared for. Charlotte stepped closer, raising her dying phone to illuminate the canvas. It was a portrait painted by John Singer Sargent. The signature and the date, 1892, were clearly visible in the bottom right corner. The brushwork was flawless, capturing the subject with breathtaking realism. The painting depicted a woman sitting in a dark velvet chair, wearing a blood-red Victorian gown. Around her neck hung an antique necklace, a massive cushion-cut diamond flanked by blood rubies, set in blackened platinum, the exact same ring that currently sat heavy on Charlotte's left hand. But it wasn't the jewelry that made Charlotte's blood run entirely cold. It was the woman's face. The woman in the 1892 painting had Charlotte's exact face. Her auburn hair, her emerald green eyes, the slight curve of her jaw, the tiny freckle just above her left eyebrow. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was a mirror image. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plaque was bolted to the frame. Charlotte leaned in, her trembling hands barely holding the phone steady enough to read the engraved words. Clarissa Montgomery, beloved wife, died 1893. Charlotte stumbled back, her phone slipping from her numb fingers and clattering loudly onto the hardwood floor. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging the gallery into absolute, terrifying darkness. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the shadows behind her. "I told you the West Wing was forbidden." Charlotte spun around. Two pale, glowing grey eyes pierced the darkness, hovering just inches from her face. Alistair had found her. The darkness of the West Wing gallery was absolute, save for the terrifying, unearthly luminescence of Alistair's pale grey eyes. Charlotte's breath seized in her lungs. The air around them grew instantly frigid, the ambient temperature plummeting as if the walls themselves were exhaling winter. "Alistair," Charlotte choked out, pressing her spine against the heavy gilded frame of the Sargent portrait. The wood dug sharply into her shoulder blades. "Who is she? Why does she have my face?" Alistair stepped forward, his movements utterly silent on the ancient floorboards. He reached down and retrieved her fallen phone, his thumb brushing the screen. The flashlight flared back to life, illuminating the sharp, ruthless angles of his face. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, terrifyingly revered. "She does not have your face, Charlotte," Alistair corrected, his velvet voice echoing softly off the vaulted ceilings. He raised the light, illuminating the painted features of the woman in the blood-red gown. "You have hers." He reached out, his ice-cold fingertips brushing Charlotte's jawline. She flinched, but the wall behind her offered no escape. "Clarissa," he murmured, the name rolling off his tongue with a heavy, centuries-old grief. "My first and only true wife, the jewel of the New York elite. When I first met her at an Astor family masquerade in 1890, she was wearing a gown of crushed sapphire. She was the only human I ever deemed worthy of eternity. But human bodies are so devastatingly fragile." Charlotte's mind raced, struggling to process the impossible. "You're telling me I'm a reincarnation? That's madness. I'm a conservator at the Met. I grew up in Connecticut. My parents were dentists." Biology is a chaotic, repetitive machine, Alistair replied dismissively, stepping back to admire the portrait. I have spent 134 years scouring the globe for the genetic echo that would bring her back to me. Do you know how much a man can build in a century, Charlotte? I funded the expeditions that unearthed the tomb of Tutankhamun just to search for ancient preservation texts. I manipulated the stock market crash of 1929 to bankrupt rival covens. I built my fortune in private equity, hiding in plain sight behind modern banking conglomerates, all while employing thousands of private investigators to search the world for your face. The puzzle pieces of their whirlwind romance violently snapped into place. The instant obsession, the refusal to take her out in daylight, the antique ring that now felt like a lead weight on her finger. You don't love me, Charlotte whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The charming billionaire who had rented out Per Se and sent Baccarat roses had never existed. You don't even know me. You just wanted her back. Alistair turned to her, his expression hardening. You are her. The soul is the same. It is merely confused by a century of modern noise. You just need to remember, I brought you to Ironwood Estate to strip away the meaningless human life you constructed. Here, surrounded by her things, wearing her jewels, you will shed Charlotte and become Clarissa once more. I am not Clarissa, Charlotte shouted, pushing past him. The sudden burst of adrenaline fueled her legs as she sprinted blindly down the dark gallery. She didn't make it 10 feet. Alistair moved with a speed that defied physics. One moment he was by the painting, and the next he was directly in front of her, catching her firmly by the shoulders. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of her. You will not run from me, he commanded, his voice dropping into a resonant, monstrous timbre that vibrated in Charlotte's chest. The veneer of the civilized gentleman was entirely gone. His canines were fully descended, resting sharply against his bottom lip. You are my wife, in the eyes of the mortal law and the immortal code. If you try to flee Ironwood, the wolves that patrol the perimeter of this property will tear you to shreds before you even reach the main road. He adjusted the lapels of his custom Tom Ford suit, instantly regaining his icy composure. Return to your chambers, Charlotte. It is nearly dawn. I must rest, and you have much to process. Tomorrow Mrs. Gable will assist you in exploring the East Wing. I suggest you acquaint yourself with your new home. Without another word, Alistair turned and melted into the shadows of the gallery, leaving Charlotte alone in the dark with the ghost of 1892. When the morning sun finally broke over the Adirondacks, filtering weakly through the heavy velvet-draped windows of her suite, Charlotte had not slept a single minute. She sat huddled in the center of the massive crimson bed, her mind running 1,000,000 miles an hour. Alistair was a vampire. The staff were either vampires or brainwashed thralls. She was imprisoned in a high-tech, off-grid fortress masked as a Victorian manor, located miles from civilization, and the man holding her captive believed she was the reincarnation of his dead wife. A sharp, rhythmic knock at the door broke the silence. The locks clicked, and Mrs. Gable entered, pushing an antique silver trolley. The housekeeper's skin looked even more parchment-like in the daylight, her eyes sunken hollows of obedience. Good morning, my lady, Mrs. Gable croaked. I have brought you breakfast, freshly imported brioche, Vermont butter, and Earl Grey tea. The master is resting in his crypt beneath the foundations. You have the run of the East Wing until sunset. Charlotte stared at the tray. Her stomach churned violently, but her pragmatic mind, the mind of a historian and researcher, kicked in. If she was going to survive, she needed energy, she needed a clear head, and she needed information. Thank you, Mrs. Gable, Charlotte said, forcing her voice to remain steady. I will eat in the conservatory. As you wish, Mrs. Gable bowed stiffly and withdrew. 30 minutes later, Charlotte ventured out of her suite. The manor in daylight was no less terrifying. It simply looked older, more tragic. The silence was absolute. No birds chirped outside the reinforced glass. No staff bustled in the halls. She found the conservatory at the end of the East Wing. It was a sprawling, glass-domed room filled with overgrown, exotic flora. Twisted vines of deadly nightshade, black orchids, and massive ferns choked the air with a heavy, humid sweetness. At the center of the room sat a wrought-iron patio set and a small, trickling stone fountain. Charlotte sat at the table, ignoring the breakfast tray, and began a systematic search of the room. If Alistair believed she was Clarissa, he had likely kept Clarissa's belongings intact. As a conservator, Charlotte knew exactly where people hid things in the 19th century. She checked beneath the cushions of the iron chairs, behind the heavy ceramic pots, and along the baseboards of the brick walls. Finally, near a massive, overgrown weeping fig tree, she noticed a single red brick that sat slightly unevenly in the masonry. Using a butter knife from her breakfast tray, Charlotte pried the brick loose. Behind it was a small, dusty cavity. Inside lay a crumbling, leather-bound journal. The leather was dry and cracking, bearing the gold leaf-embossed initials, CM. Charlotte's hands shook as she pulled the journal out and sat at the table. She opened the fragile pages. The handwriting was elegant, sweeping cursive in faded iron-gall ink. The first few entries detailed a life of immense luxury and superficial worries. Clarissa wrote of attending soirees at the Waldorf Astoria, shopping for Parisian silks, and her whirlwind romance with a mysterious wealthy investor named Alistair Montgomery. It mirrored Charlotte's own experience with terrifying precision. But as the dates progressed into late 1892, the tone of the diary shifted dramatically. The ink strokes became frantic, the words smeared with what looked like ancient tear stains. October 14th, 1892. He does not sleep in a bed. I found him in the cellars today, resting inside a coffin lined with soil. I am married to a demon. He drinks from the servants. I hear their muffled screams in the night, but in the morning, they smile at me with hollow, dead eyes. He says he is preparing me for the dark gift. He says we will rule the shadows together. Charlotte's blood ran cold. Clarissa hadn't been a willing participant in Alistair's dark fairy tale. She had been a terrified captive, just like Charlotte. She flipped the pages rapidly, scanning the frantic scrawlings. November 2nd, 1892. I tried to run. Richard caught me at the iron gates. Alistair was furious. He did not strike me. He is too refined for physical violence. But he locked me in the West Wing gallery for 3 days without food. He says my human weakness disgusts him, but it will soon be cured. He plans to turn me on the night of the winter solstice, my 29th birthday. Charlotte stopped reading, her heart slamming against her ribs. Her 29th birthday. Charlotte's own 29th birthday was exactly 3 weeks away, on the winter solstice. The horrific parallel was undeniable. Alistair was recreating history, step by step. She turned to the final, hastily written page of the diary. The ink was heavily blotted, the handwriting barely legible. December the 20th, 1892. Tomorrow is the solstice. I will not let him take my soul. I have stolen a bottle of laudanum from Mrs. Gable's medicinal cabinet. If I cannot escape this fortress in life, I will escape it in death. I write this hidden behind the weeping fig, praying to God that if some poor, wretched soul ever finds themselves trapped by Alistair Montgomery, they read this warning. Do not trust his promises of eternity. The only thing waiting for you in the dark is an endless, waking nightmare. Find the master key in his study. The lock code for the perimeter gates is the year of his mortal death, 1745. Run. Charlotte closed the diary, the brittle leather groaning under her grip. A cold, fierce determination replaced the paralyzing fear that had gripped her since the Maybach ride. Clarissa Montgomery had chosen death over becoming a monster. She had died in this very house, driven to suicide by the man who claimed to love her. But in her final moments, she had left behind the exact tools Charlotte needed to survive. Alistair thought he had brought home a docile reincarnation, a woman who would quietly accept her fate and don the antique diamond ring. He had underestimated the modern woman entirely. Charlotte was a scholar, a survivor, and she now held the keys to his undoing. She carefully placed the diary back into the wall cavity and replaced the brick, ensuring it looked entirely undisturbed. She dusted the dirt from her trembling hands and sat back at the wrought iron table. She had 3 weeks. 3 weeks to find the master key in a vampire's heavily guarded study, bypass a staff of undead thralls, and unlock the perimeter gates using the code 1745. As the antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the noon hour, Charlotte took a slow, deliberate sip of her lukewarm Earl Grey tea. The game of cat and mouse had officially begun, and she had no intention of being the prey. For the first 14 days of her captivity, Charlotte became the world's greatest actress. Survival dictated that she shed her modern independence and stepped seamlessly into the role of the tragic, subservient Victorian bride. She stopped asking questions about the outside world. She ceased her demands for a telephone. When Alistair rose from his subterranean crypt just after dusk, she greeted him in the grand foyer, her eyes demurely cast downward, wearing the heavy silk gowns he had Mrs. Gable deliver to her chambers. Alistair was thrilled. His pale grey eyes gleamed with arrogant triumph as he watched her seemingly surrender to his reality. "The modern noise is fading," he whispered one evening, kissing her cold cheek. "Clarissa is waking up." But beneath the corseted silk and the terrified exterior, Charlotte's mind was a hyper-focused machine. She was an art restorer. Her entire career was built on extreme patience, forensic observation, and the meticulous unraveling of hidden layers. She applied these exact skills to Ironwood Estate. During the daylight hours, when Alistair was paralyzed by the sun and confined to his crypt, Charlotte mapped the enemy's territory. She noted the exact routines of the undead thralls, organizing their movements in her mind to identify the blind spots in the manor's security. The Ironwood Daylight Security Matrix, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Mrs. Gable oversees the cleaning of the Grand Foyer and the East Wing corridors. High visibility, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. The perimeter guards, massive, silent men who smelled like wet fur, patrol the exterior courtyard. Exterior lockdown, 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. Staff retreat to the subterranean kitchens to prepare the evening's meals. Primary vulnerability window, 2 p.m. Sunset. Richard stands guard at the entrance of the West Wing. Complete impassability. Her target was Alistair's private study, located on the second floor of the East Wing, just past the library. According to Clarissa's 1892 diary, the master key to the perimeter gates was kept there, but getting inside was a seemingly impossible task. The door was solid mahogany, locked with a heavy brass deadbolt, and flanked by 2 unblinking thralls at all times, except during the crucial 2-hour window at midday. Charlotte needed a distraction, and she found it in the very art that Alistair hoarded. On her 8th day, she convinced Alistair to let her set up a small conservation workspace in the library. "If I am to spend eternity here," she had murmured to him, staring at a smoke-damaged 17th-century landscape, "I wish to preserve your collection. It connects me to the past." He had eagerly provided her with the chemicals she requested: distilled water, ethanol, acetone, and ammonia. To a layman, they were cleaning supplies. To Charlotte, they were the ingredients for a volatile chemical reaction. On the 15th day, precisely at 12:15 p.m., Charlotte enacted her plan. She mixed a high concentration of acetone and ammonia in a small glass jar, adding a crumpled wad of steel wool she had stolen from the kitchen. She shoved the jar behind a heavy velvet curtain in the library, directly next to a roaring fireplace. Within minutes, the thermal heat accelerated the chemical reaction. Thick, acrid, blinding white smoke began to pour from the curtain, smelling strongly of sulfur and burning fabric. The smoke alarms, a modern addition to the ancient house, began to shriek with deafening intensity. The 2 thralls guarding Alistair's study abandoned their posts, their brainwashed minds programmed to protect the estate from fire. As they rushed into the smoke-filled library, Charlotte slipped out from behind a bookshelf, crossed the hall, and pressed herself against the study door. She didn't have the key, but she had a vial of pure hydrochloric acid she had synthesized from the cleaning supplies. She poured it directly into the brass keyhole. The metal hissed and bubbled violently, toxic fumes burning Charlotte's eyes. She counted to 30, grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from a nearby console, and smashed it against the weakened locking mechanism. With a sickening crunch, the deadbolt gave way. Charlotte slipped inside and silently closed the door behind her. Alistair's study was a jarring collision of centuries. The walls were lined with ancient, crumbling grimoires and weapons forged in the Middle Ages. Yet sitting on a massive mahogany desk was a multi-monitor computer setup that looked like it belonged in the Pentagon. Charlotte rushed to the desk, her eyes scanning the scattered documents. This was how Alistair Montgomery maintained his phantom empire. She saw heavily redacted portfolios bearing the logo of Palantir Technologies, detailing encrypted satellite routing to keep the estate entirely off the global grid. There were massive acquisition files from Sotheby's, showing how he laundered his centuries-old wealth through anonymous art purchases. He wasn't just a monster. He was a corporate ghost operating at the highest echelons of modern finance. But Charlotte wasn't here for his financial secrets. She ripped open the desk drawers, her hands shaking. "Where is it? Where is the key?" In the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a false wooden panel, she found a heavy, black iron lockbox. It required a 4-digit code. The lock code for the perimeter gates is the year of his mortal death. Charlotte's fingers flew over the keypad, punching in the numbers Clarissa had left behind. 1745. The lockbox clicked green and hissed open. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was not a traditional key, but a terrifying hybrid. It was an ancient, heavy iron skeleton key, but the bow of the key had been hollowed out and embedded with a modern, high-grade RFID microchip. This was the only thing that could bypass both the ancient iron chains and the modern biometric sensors guarding the estate. Charlotte snatched the key, shoved it deep into the bodice of her dress, and closed the lockbox. She slipped out of the study, just as the thralls successfully extinguished the smoldering curtain in the library. She had the key. The first impossible hurdle was cleared, but the hardest part was yet to come. The atmosphere in Ironwood Estate shifted violently as the winter solstice approached. The quiet, suffocating isolation of the manor was replaced by a frantic, dark energy. Exactly 1 week before Charlotte's 29th birthday, Alistair informed her that they were hosting a banquet. "The old blood is gathering," he told her, standing by the fireplace in her suite, as she sat frozen at her vanity. He held out a heavy garment bag. "They have heard whispers that my queen has returned. Tonight, you will be formally presented to the inner circle. You will wear this." Charlotte unzipped the bag. Inside was a breathtaking, terrifyingly familiar gown of blood-red velvet and black lace. It was an exact replica of the dress Clarissa wore in the 1892 John Singer Sargent portrait. "It's beautiful," Charlotte lied, her voice hollow. Alistair smiled, his fangs catching the firelight. "Do not disappoint me tonight, Clarissa. They are not as civilized as I am." When Charlotte descended the grand staircase at midnight, the foyer was unrecognizable. The chandeliers were dimmed, casting long, monstrous shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, heavy perfumes, and a metallic undertone that made Charlotte's stomach violently rebel. The dining hall was filled with roughly 24 guests. They wore modern haute couture, Tom Ford, Chanel, Alexander McQueen, but their eyes betrayed their true nature. They moved with predatory, insect-like grace. The moment Charlotte entered on Alistair's arm, the room fell into a dead, absolute silence. 24 pairs of glowing, inhuman eyes locked onto her. Alistair guided her to the head of a massive, candle-lit banquet table. To maintain her sanity and gauge the threats, Charlotte mentally categorized the predators in her immediate vicinity. The inner circle threats: name, appearance, demeanor, / threat level. Alistair cold, aristocratic, perfectly composed, extreme, possessive, and observant. Victoria stunningly beautiful, blonde, wearing diamonds that looked centuries old. High, stared at Charlotte with undisguised jealousy and lethal hunger. Cassian young, reckless, wearing a tailored suit with a loosened tie, eyes completely black, very high, unpredictable, openly hostile toward human presence. Richard towering, silent, standing guard at the door rather than sitting. Critical. He is the enforcer. He catches those who run. The feast was a grotesque pantomime of human dining. The thralls brought out silver platters of rare, bloody meats and poured dark, thick red liquid from crystal decanters into the guests' goblets. Charlotte stared at her empty porcelain plate, her hands trembling in her lap, the heavy RFID skeleton key pressing coldly against her ribs beneath her corset. "She smells fragile," Victoria murmured from across the table, swirling the thick liquid in her glass. She didn't look at Charlotte. She looked at Alistair. "Are you certain she can survive the transition, Alistair? The last human you attempted to turn went mad before the solstice." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat, but she forced her face to remain utterly impassive. She channeled every ounce of her acting ability, projecting an aura of bored aristocratic disdain. "She is Clarissa," Alistair said simply, taking Charlotte's hand and kissing her knuckles. His skin was freezing. "She possesses a fortitude none of you could comprehend." Cassian, seated to Charlotte's right, leaned in uncomfortably close. He smelled like expensive cologne and fresh copper. "Is that so?" he whispered, his voice a low, vibrating purr. "She doesn't look like a queen. She looks like a terrified little bird waiting for its neck to be snapped." Cassian reached under the table, his icy, marble-hard hand clamping painfully over Charlotte's knee. Panic spiked in Charlotte's chest, but she knew if she screamed, she would prove him right. If she acted like prey, the entire room would tear her apart. She needed to assert dominance. She needed to act like the monster Alistair believed her to be. With a swift, fluid motion, Charlotte grabbed a heavy, silver steak knife from the table. Without breaking eye contact with Cassian, she slammed the blade down directly between his outstretched fingers, burying the tip 2 inches deep into the solid oak dining table. The entire room gasped. The silence that followed was deafening. Cassian froze, looking at the knife quivering, just a millimeter from his pale skin. He slowly raised his eyes to meet Charlotte's. "Touch me again," Charlotte said, her voice dropping into a cold, deadpan whisper that echoed perfectly in the cavernous room. "And I will see how quickly your severed hands regenerate." For a terrifying second, Charlotte thought Cassian was going to lunge at her. His canines snapped down, his eyes bleeding into a furious, bottomless black. But then, a slow, booming laugh erupted from the head of the table. Alistair was laughing. He looked at Charlotte with an expression of pure, unadulterated obsession. "You see," Alistair addressed the room, his chest swelling with pride. "The fire of 1892 still burns within her. She will rule you all." Cassian slowly pulled his hand away from the knife, a vicious, calculating smirk spreading across his face. "Indeed, my lord, I look forward to the solstice." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of terrifying, strained conversation. Charlotte had successfully established her facade. But as she watched the guests drink their horrific wine, a chilling realization washed over her. Cassian hadn't touched her knee just to intimidate her. When his hand had brushed against her skirt, he had been feeling for something. Later that night, securely locked back in her suite, Charlotte reached into her corset to retrieve the heavy iron key. Her blood ran entirely cold. The key was still there, but the modern RFID microchip that had been embedded in the bow, the only piece of technology that could bypass the perimeter's biometric locks, had been expertly, silently pried out. Cassian had stolen the chip. Charlotte collapsed onto the edge of the velvet bed, the air leaving her lungs in a shaky, terrified gasp. She was trapped. She had the iron key, but without the chip, the gates would remain permanently sealed. Cassian knew she was planning to escape, and he had just taken her only ticket out. The solstice was exactly 7 days away, and Charlotte was no longer just fighting Alistair. She was caught in the middle of a deadly, centuries-old political war between vampires, and she was the main course. For 48 hours after the Blood Moon banquet, Charlotte existed in a state of sheer, suffocating dread. Without the RFID chip, the heavy iron key was just a useless piece of antique metal. The perimeter gates of Ironwood Estate were an impenetrable fortress of modern security and ancient magic, sealing her inside with a coven of monsters. The winter solstice was only 5 days away. If Charlotte didn't adapt, she was going to die, or worse, be reborn into a nightmare. Charlotte realized she had fundamentally misjudged the situation. She had been treating this like a hostage scenario, trying to sneak out the back door. But you don't sneak away from apex predators. You have to turn them against each other. Cassian didn't steal the chip to impress Alistair. If he wanted to expose her, he would have done it at the banquet. He stole it for leverage. Cassian was ambitious, reckless, and deeply resentful of Alistair's ancient, unwavering authority. During the daylight hours of her 22nd day of captivity, Charlotte snuck back into the library. She didn't need to break into Alistair's study again. During her first infiltration, she had slipped a small, encrypted USB drive from his desk into her pocket, assuming it held financial blackmail. She plugged the drive into a bulky, offline laptop she had found abandoned in a dusty reading room. What she uncovered on that drive shattered the last remaining fragments of her reality. Charlotte wasn't a spiritual reincarnation. The ghost of 1892 was not magically reborn into her body. It was a cold, calculated, and horrifyingly real scientific operation. The Clarissa Protocol Files, 1985. Alistair establishes shell corporations to heavily invest in early genomic mapping and biotech firms, secretly funding what would eventually become giants like Illumina Genomics. 2008, utilizing mass data harvesting from commercial DNA databases like 23andMe and Ancestry, Alistair's private operatives isolate the exact genetic descendants of Clarissa Montgomery's extended mortal family line. 2012 to present, employing illegal underground CRISPR gene editing trials on unsuspecting IVF patients in a private Connecticut fertility clinic, Alistair manipulated Charlotte's own embryonic development. Charlotte stared at the screen, bile rising in her throat. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. Her parents, her normal, boring dentist parents, had gone to a high-end fertility clinic because they struggled to conceive. Alistair had orchestrated her very existence. He had bred her like a prize-winning show dog, meticulously manipulating alleles and chromosomes over decades to perfectly recreate the face, the hair, and the eyes of his dead wife. She wasn't a queen, she was a lab rat. The revelation ignited a cold, lethal fury inside Charlotte. The terrified Victorian bride died in that dusty library, replaced by a woman with nothing left to lose. That evening, as dusk settled over the Adirondacks and the undead began to stir, Charlotte bypassed the dining hall and walked straight into the West Wing's billiards room. Cassian was there, casually racking a set of ivory billiard balls, a glass of thick red liquid resting on the edge of the mahogany table. "You're a long way from your cage, little bird," Cassian purred, not looking up from the table. "Alistair will be terribly displeased." "Alistair's displeasure is the least of your concerns," Charlotte replied evenly, stepping into the dim light. She pulled a thick stack of printed documents from her corset, the financial ledgers she had decrypted from the USB drive. "I want the chip, Cassian, and in exchange, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom." Cassian paused, his black eyes flicking to the papers. "You think you have something I want?" "I know you want to overthrow him," Charlotte said, her voice steady, echoing with a cold authority that made Cassian actually stand up straight. "But you can't. He controls the wealth. He controls the shell companies through UBS Group AG, the offshore accounts in the Caymans, and the Palantir encrypted communication networks that keep your coven hidden from global governments. If you kill him, you inherit nothing but a target on your back. You need his master routing codes to transfer the wealth before the solstice." She tossed the decrypted files onto the billiard table. "I have the routing numbers. I have the digital master keys to his entire global financial empire. Give me the RFID chip and ensure Richard is distracted at the gates tomorrow night. You get the money and the throne. I get my life. Cassian picked up the papers, his eyes scanning the incredibly complex, highly classified financial routing data. A slow, wicked smile spread across his pale face, his fangs gleaming in the low light. He realized she was telling the truth. "You really aren't Clarissa, are you?" Cassian murmured, genuine, dangerous respect lacing his tone. "No," Charlotte said, her eyes locked onto his. "I am the woman who is going to burn his legacy to the ground." Cassian reached into his tailored vest pocket, pulling out the tiny black RFID microchip. He tossed it onto the green felt of the billiard table. "Pleasure doing business with you, Charlotte. Try not to die in the snow." The night of the winter solstice arrived with a brutal, howling blizzard. The temperature dropped to 5 below zero, the wind screaming against the heavy stone walls of Ironwood Estate. Charlotte stood in front of the vanity mirror in her suite, wearing the heavy, blood-red velvet gown. She had intricately pinned her auburn hair up, hiding a small glass vial of concentrated sulfuric acid, synthesized from her conservation supplies, deep within the thick curls. In her corset, she secured the iron skeleton key, now fully re-equipped with the RFID microchip. At midnight, Alistair arrived. He looked like a dark god of the underworld, dressed entirely in black, his pale grey eyes practically vibrating with anticipation. "It is time, my love," he whispered, extending his freezing hand. "Tonight the mortal coil breaks. Tonight you return to me entirely." Charlotte took his hand, keeping her expression perfectly serene. "Lead the way." Instead of going to the banquet hall, Alistair led her down the servants' spiral staircase, descending deep into the bedrock beneath the manor. The catacombs were a terrifying labyrinth of stone arches lit by flickering iron torches. The air was frigid, smelling of damp earth and centuries of dried blood. They entered a massive, circular cavern. The entire inner circle was gathered there, cloaked in dark velvet, their eyes glowing hungrily in the shadows. In the center of the room sat a massive, ancient stone altar, stained black from centuries of dark rituals. "Brothers and sisters," Alistair's voice boomed through the cavern, resonant and powerful. "For a century I have searched. For a century we have waited. Tonight, the Queen reclaims her throne." The coven erupted into a chorus of terrifying, unnatural hisses and murmurs of approval. Alistair turned to Charlotte, his fangs fully descended, a look of pure, manic obsession on his face. He reached out to pull her onto the altar. 3, 2, 1, Charlotte counted in her head. "Wait," a voice echoed from the back of the cavern. The crowd parted. Cassian stepped forward, flanked by 6 younger, fiercely loyal vampires. He wasn't wearing ceremonial robes, he was wearing a tactical jacket, his eyes black and murderous. "She doesn't belong on that altar, Alistair," Cassian spat, the venom in his voice palpable. "And you no longer belong on the throne. Your obsession with a dead woman has blinded you. You've gone soft, playing human corporate games while we starve in the shadows." Alistair's expression shifted from manic joy to an absolute, terrifying rage. The temperature in the cavern plummeted so rapidly that Charlotte's breath crystallized in the air. "Treason!" Alistair hissed, his voice no longer velvet, but the sound of grinding stone. "You dare challenge me in my own crypt? It's not your crypt anymore," Cassian roared. Chaos erupted. Cassian's faction lunged. The older, loyalist vampires intercepted them. The cavern dissolved into a blur of blinding speed, the sickening crunch of bone, and feral, monstrous shrieks. Alistair moved to protect Charlotte, grabbing her arm to shield her from the fray. "Stay behind me," he commanded. This was her moment. Charlotte ripped her arm from his grasp. As Alistair turned, momentarily stunned by her defiance, Charlotte reached into her hair, pulled out the glass vial of sulfuric acid, and smashed it directly across Alistair's pale, flawless face. A scream, a sound so unearthly and agonizing that it shook the dust from the cavern ceiling, tore from Alistair's throat. He fell to his knees, his hands clutching his burning, blistering flesh, the corrosive acid eating through his immortal skin with vicious speed. Charlotte didn't look back. She hiked up the heavy velvet skirts of the 1892 gown and ran. She sprinted up the spiral stairs, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She burst out onto the ground floor, crossing the empty grand foyer. The front doors were unguarded. Cassian had kept his promise. Charlotte threw her shoulder against the heavy oak doors, bursting out into the freezing, howling blizzard. The obsidian gravel of the courtyard tore through her thin silk slippers, but the adrenaline masked the pain. The massive wrought iron gates loomed 50 yards ahead, barely visible through the blinding snow. She was halfway there when a massive shadow dropped from the roof of the portico directly into her path. It was Richard. The towering enforcer didn't look human anymore. His jaw had unhinged slightly, his eyes entirely black, his posture hunched and feral. "You belong to the master," Richard snarled, stepping toward her. Charlotte stumbled backward, her hand frantically reaching into her corset. She didn't have any acid left. She pulled out the heavy iron skeleton key, holding it like a pathetic weapon. Richard laughed, a low guttural sound, and lunged at her. But as he moved, a massive, deafening crack echoed over the howling wind. Richard's chest violently exploded outward. He stumbled, looking down at the massive, gaping hole where his heart used to be, before collapsing face first into the snow. Charlotte gasped, dropping to her knees. Standing 20 yards to her left, half hidden by the blizzard, was Victoria. The blonde vampire was holding a heavily modified military-grade hunting rifle, likely stolen from the estate's armory, smoke still pouring from the barrel. Victoria lowered the weapon, her eyes meeting Charlotte's through the storm. She didn't smile. She just gave a sharp, definitive nod. She didn't save Charlotte out of mercy. She saved her because Charlotte was removing the one thing standing between Victoria and the throne. Charlotte scrambled to her feet, racing the final few yards to the iron gates. She found the biometric control panel hidden within the stone pillar. Her freezing, trembling fingers slammed the iron skeleton key into the slot. The embedded RFID chip flashed a brilliant green. The heavy, ancient mechanisms groaned. The writhing iron briars and ravens slowly swung outward, opening to the dark, snow-covered logging road. Charlotte ran. She didn't stop to catch her breath, didn't look back at the Gothic monstrosity of Ironwood Estate. She ran into the freezing darkness until her legs gave out, until the sun began to crack over the Adirondack Mountains, casting a pale, blinding light over the world. Hours later, half frozen and delirious, Charlotte collapsed onto the asphalt of a state highway. The screeching brakes of a FedEx delivery truck were the last thing she heard before the darkness took her. Charlotte Gray survived the winter solstice. She escaped the architectural trap, the genetic prison, and the monster who engineered her. But as she lay recovering in a sterile hospital room in Albany days later, she looked down at her left hand. The antique cushion-cut diamond ring was gone, lost somewhere in the snow. But Charlotte knew the truth. Vampires don't forgive, and billionaires don't forget. Alistair Montgomery was still out there, his face scarred, his empire fractured, and his obsession burning hotter than ever. The fairy tale was over, but the war for her soul had only just begun. Charlotte pulled off the ultimate escape, but with Alistair surviving that brutal acid attack and his genetic obsession completely exposed, the hunt is far from over. Will Cassian's treasonous coup hold up, or is the Vampire King already planning his ruthless revenge to drag Charlotte back to the dark? The twists are only getting crazier, and you absolutely cannot miss what happens next. If you loved this intense, dark romance thriller, smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you're first in line for the epic continuation.